Hello, welcome back to the Painted Mini. My name is Travis. I'm your host, and I hope you're having a hot Lisan Al Gaib summer. Today we're going to get into Dune, specifically C'MON's War for Arrakis. In this video, we're going to paint the vehicles, so stick around.
Steel suit is full of piss. My head is caked in sand. Save me from these utter morons. Another world. Another land.
He broke off, leaned forward. Dust cloud ahead, sire. I see it, Gurney. That's what we seek, Kynes said. Paul stretched up in the seat to peer ahead, saw a rolling yellow cloud low on the desert surface, some 30 kilometers ahead. One of your factory crawlers, Kynes said. It's on the surface, and that means it's on spice. The cloud is vented, and sand being expelled after the spice has been centrifugically removed. There's no other cloud quite like it. Aircraft over it, the Duke said. I see 2, 3, 4 spotters, Kynes said. They're watching for worm sign. Worm sign, the Duke asked. A sand wave moving toward the crawler. They'll have seismic probes on the surface, too. Kynes swung his gaze around the sky. Should be a carry-all wing around, but I don't see it. The worms always come, eh? Alec asked. Always. Paul leaned forward, touching Kynes' shoulder. How big an area does each worm stake out? Kynes frowned. The child kept asking adult questions. Well, that depends on the size of the worm. He broke off as the Duke kicked on the jet brakes. The ship bucked as its tall pods whispered to silence. Stub wings elongated, cupped the air. The craft became a full thopter as the Duke banked it, holding the wings to a gentle beat, pointing with his left hand off to the east beyond the factory crawler. Is that worm sign? Where the Duke pointed, crescent dune tracks spread shadow ripples toward the horizon, and running through them, as a level line stretching into the distance, came an elongated mountain motion, a cresting of sand. It reminded Paul of the way a big fish disturbed the water when swimming just under the surface. Worm, Kynes said. Big one. He leaned back, grabbed a microphone from the panel, punched out a new frequency selection. Glancing at the grid chart on rollers over their heads, he spoke into the microphone. Calling crawler at Delta Ajax Niner. Worm sign. Warning. Crawler at Delta Ajax Niner. Okay, I start out with Vallejo primer through my airbrush. Pretty simple procedure. I will say that these minis presented more challenge than any I've ever painted before as far as priming goes. It's just all the little cracks, crevices, nooks, and crannies. You can still see red right up to the very end. These guys here were a bit of a struggle, but I got there. My next step is I went ahead and mixed a AK gunmetal color, which I love and I've used for years, 50-50 with matte black from the Fanatic series. I'm trying to switch everything over to Fanatic, but I still have a couple of pet paints, such as the AK gunmetal, that I'm still gonna take out when I need them. And this just gives it a little bit of a sheen, a little bit of shine to it. And throughout this, I'm just trying to keep it as quick and simple as possible. Keep in mind, there's multiples of each model. I don't want to burn out. Here I go with Mephisto Red. One of the issues with the Fanatic paint line is the red is not a very solid bright red because they're putting so much pigment in there to create that density. They're using white paint, which sort of gives everything a bit of a pinkish tint. The other complaint that I can agree with, that I've heard a lot about the Fanatic line, is just the fact that it does dry fast. I haven't really used a paint retarder yet, but I tend to do all of my painting from a wet palette. I add a lot of water to begin with, but it still will dry up pretty quick. I'm not being careful here. I'm just going through and mostly using the reference image from CMON. I do just pick out my own little accents here and there, but mostly keeping in line with their image. Nothing fancy, just base coating specific pieces, creating those red accents. I went back and looked at the old Dune encyclopedia. It was the unofficial encyclopedia that came out after Hebert wrote the book. And it has different levels of, we'll say, scholarly research and intent. Yeah, I think even Hebert acknowledges it. He actually accepted it, even though it was sort of an unofficial thing, because people just put so much work and love into it. But they go all into the harvesters and the whole operation in minute detail. That's where most of the modern RPGs and the movies, the films, are pulling all of this information from to sort of round this world out. But they definitely had the harvester is something that started out pretty simple through trial and error, has become what it is here. This is sort of the modern variation where you sort of have the harvester that sucks up the spice and actually does a little bit of separation. It has a little bit of a factory aspect to it. And then once the harvester is picked up by the carryall, it empties its tanks, and the carryall does some processing as well. It creates these bricks, which are then further processed once it gets to into the city of Carthage. But the harvester here, what you're seeing mostly is just tanks where they store spice. Just a big vacuum cleaner. So you got, looks like 2 of the tanks here are different than the other 4. I'm not sure if they're part of the engine or some other resource. Maybe it's air. Who knows? But it's funny, the original art in the Dune Encyclopedia is very rudimentary and basic. And I'll be fair as well, Hebert's descriptions are pretty basic and rudimentary as well. He just has this vehicle, which he describes as a beetle with a funnel nose, sucking up spice and then shooting it out of the back, sort of spouting it out. So we have to take our hats off to all these modern game companies and film production studios who are sort of reinterpreting and coming up with a much more modern, sleek vision for some of this. Okay, so I went ahead, I finished up the red coat of everything, and now I'm just going to go over with some wash. Super simple. This little paint tray I'm using, little palette, is actually one of those little kids' fidget poppers. Somebody online was extolling the virtues of these things as perfect little silicone paint pots for washes, metallics, all those things that you don't want to put on a wet palette. And I gotta say, it's great because once you fill up all your little cups and you have to go clean it out, it's as simple as just popping the back. And usually the whole piece of paint pops out. You rarely have to really go in and wash it much. So here I'm using AP Fanatic Pure Red as my highlight color, and just doing a real quick, nasty, getting those exposed areas. What I'll do sometimes, I'll just see where the light is hitting the model and where it's casting those reflections, that's where I highlight. You don't have to put too much thought into it. You can sit there and say, okay, whatever's higher would be closer to the light. Or you can just hold the model up near a light and highlight the parts that actually reflect light. Pretty simple. Here I'm going in just trying to give a little bit of depth to this because I want this, especially that cockpit area, to have some depth to it so it looks kind of like a multi-layered plexiglass cockpit of sorts. So I'm using a red shade from, once again, Citadel. Let's just give it a little bit more dynamic color depth. And that's it for the harvesters. We're going to move on now to the carry-all wings. Comes with 3 in the base set, which are Harkonnen. Oh, and then there's a big Mama Jama there sneaking in. I do have the expansions, and I will be putting out videos for the expansion. You're seeing the Smugglers behemoth there. So for this, I wanted to do something, give it some rally stripes, right? I want to do a little striping with the airbrush, so I just go in, have this little 1/4-inch tape, which is pretty useful. And I'm just using this straight edge from my little template there. And there's our pure red, and I'm just spraying basically a red stripe through the middle, leaving the sides black. And the airbrush is just one way to sort of cheat a little bit when it comes to blending. The problem with blending, and I try to avoid it like the plague in all of its variations, is that it takes forever. Airbrush is probably one of the quicker cheats to where you get a little bit of a blend, because as the paint sprays farther from the nozzle, it goes on lighter, so it creates a nice clean gradation around the edges. So you can see there I just did a red stripe, and I've got a piece of tape down the middle, which here I've pulled off. So I'm going back to my AK gunmetal, and I'm mixing it with Fanatic Deep Gray, doing the exact same thing I did with the Harvester. I'm just trying to create kind of a dark but slightly shiny, sort of a muted metal. So it's going to have a little bit of metallic, a little bit of gloss, a little bit of sheen to it. It's going to be that good, dark, foreboding Harkonnen black metal. And here I'm actually just going in and I'm painting the around the little fan blades. Get that, some of that black back. All right, here I've picked out a couple of, the cool thing about the Fanatic line is you have little color families set up. It's not perfect. There's not like a perfect variation of color between each level within a color family. Some colors seem real close and others are big gaps. They're definitely trying to cram it into a system, but it's far from perfect. You can see it right here. It looks like it's already highlighted. That's just the light hitting those spots, because those spots are at a little bit of an angle. That's half of what I highlight, are just spots. So if you look there on the left, you can see the little boxes. On the right, I'm actually just going in and coloring in those boxes. Anything that's raised up a little bit, that would take the light. I go ahead and hit it with the lighter red. And you just have to remind yourself that miniature painting, especially for a board game, people aren't going to be bearing down on your pieces with magnifying glasses. You're looking down at a table. It's just like an art gallery. You know, you see all these people in art galleries that walk right up to the painting. What are you doing? That's not how you look at art. There is a viewing distance. The artist is setting that up and working within, you know, that concept as he's painting the piece. And then you see these people in galleries that just go put their nose up to it. No one's going to do that with your minis, and if they do, you've got bigger problems. But if you take what's looking pretty rough and rudimentary here, put it down at a table level in regular lighting, it's going to look good. And it's going to look 1,000 times better than that gray color that these minis came in. So, or in this case, I think this ship was actually pink. To me, this is sort of this is where the painting gets fun. The priming, the basing, no bueno, but when you can sit and pick out the highlights, and this is where it becomes enjoyable. You don't want to get too ambitious because you're batch painting. Whatever you do to this first model, you're going to have to turn around and do to all the others. All right, there's a time-tested method there. I'm putting a stripe on my skin, and it's a way of testing whether or not your paint is thick enough. So if you end up not being able to see the texture of your skin, the paint is too thick. And if you can still see the color underneath, the color of your skin underneath the paint, then your paint is too thin. So it's kind of a good way to check it before you put it on the model. Now this is my second highlight. So the trick to this is I can only paint within the previous highlight area, and I'm painting less than I did before. So I'm really going to the edges, to the part that's going to be hit by the light. Just the edges, the rims, the tips. So you can see there I'm only painting where I previously put in the highlight, just not quite covering as much this time. Just skimming the top. This is one advantage of a paint that dries fast, like the Fanatic, AP Fanatic, is that you can just kind of work around the model. By the time you get back around, where you started is already dried, so you can just kind of go ahead and do a second coat. Because as much as every company wants to advertise it's a one-coat paint, it is not. The AP Fanatic is pretty good. It's pretty consistent. Covers well, but it still takes 2 coats. And that really depends on the color, too. The color, each color has its own formulation. So I'm not being careful. Again, people are going to be looking down at a table. It's going to look good. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to my black color, and I'm just going to touch up. I got some of the red on the cockpit. Kind of clean up that line a little bit. And I'm going to go back in and do the same thing in those little vents. Get some of the red off of the blades. Because those really shouldn't be the same color as the chassis of the aircraft. Okay, and now I'm doing an edge highlight, so I'm using an ash gray, just kind of a light color. And the trick here is you're trying to get the paint loaded on your brush, and then you're just using sort of the middle of the brush, running it along the edges. You can see sometimes I go in with the tip. But most edge highlighting, you're trying to run the edge of the brush like that. And sometimes you get a fat line, trying to keep the lines as thin as possible. And this is not only is it functioning as sort of a highlight and allowing the eye to break out and process what it's seeing, all the different parts and components of a miniature sculpt like this, but it also serves to sort of naturally weather the model. If you go look at most equipment, it's along the edges and seams where it's going to have the paint start to wear, things start to fade. So it kind of serves a dual purpose here. And the hardest thing about edge highlighting is getting the paint thin enough without being too thin. Just gotta play with it until you find the right. So it's a little bit thinner than you would use for a regular base coat, but not watery. You just need it to flow really well so you can get those thin lines. Going in and getting the edge of each fan blade here and the tip of the little center hub. And that's it. Now we move on to the Ornithopters. And I think if you noticed, for the carry-all, I actually used spray paint. And it looks like I'm using spray again here. I had a problem with my airbrush. But I can't tell the difference. I feel like I save a little money when I use the airbrush. But as long as you're using a good spray. I'm just putting a little silver stripe down the middle to serve as sort of an underlayment highlight. I don't even think that's a word. Unless you're putting on a roof. Sort of a underlayer that'll still show through. And now I'm mixing a little pink with pure red. And I was just thinking of like how insects, and these definitely look and seem to be built off of insects, speaking of. But how insects in nature will often have these bright kind of red, orange colors to denote that they are dangerous. So I'm thinking the Harkonnens are doing the same thing. Their fascist color scheme. And I am not sponsored by said company. And here I'm just trying to put a little red edge to the wings. And now I am dry brushing to pick out the little framework on the windshield. It's like an old World War II style canopy with metal framing around. I'm just using a plate mill. Okay, this was a bright idea. I wanted to use color shift paint on the wings. Not only, once again, does it kind of tie in with the obvious engineering inspiration of having insects sort of be the model for these ornithopters. It's kind of have that iridescent wing sheen. The problem I have is I'm using Vallejo. I believe this set I have is, think of the name, it's Space. It's one of the Space sets. But I've tried 3 different colors here. None of them had green in the title, but all 3 came out green for some reason. And I've had this happen before, to where their red gold has come out green in the past. And it's very green, so it kind of looks like a Christmas parade coming at you. So I was hoping that maybe it wouldn't dry quite that way, but it did. So I decided to go in and take the AP Fanatic plate mill metallic paint and just going over the green. But I mixed it 1-to-1 with a stabilizer, which is just their thinning medium for Fanatic. So I'm still going to get a little bit of green sheen come through, which is fine. Give a little bit of weirdness, some unworldly element to the metal. But for the most part, it's going to be a conventional metal-looking wing. Just a little bit of a tint. And then the last thing I want to do is I'm taking gloss varnish. I still mix it with matte. And I'm showing you there, I'm doing a 2-to-3 ratio. Gloss to matte. And I'm going to go in with a real small brush and just kind of hit some specific areas. One thing I need to do is I want to get all the cockpits of the crawlers or the harvesters so that they look more like a cockpit, a little bit of shine to them. And then the only other thing I'm going to do with the gloss is the very tops of those tanks. Just again, trying to create some colored up. On the carryalls, I decided to treat that whole top black striped area, the whole center section, as sort of an ongoing cockpit. So I went ahead and glossed all of it. And again, it's not a real shiny gloss. It's more of a satin maybe. And this is a little trickier because now I'm trying to go in between all of my dry brushing and just kind of dab the windows in with gloss. Pretty simple, just a little time consuming. And then just to bring down some of the shine on the wings, I'm going to go ahead and add the strong tone, which is just a wash. And I always dilute my washes just a little bit. Trying to get my focus to work. It looks like about 3 drops. And wash medium. You could also use water. I did one, that was only 1 drop, but you can see it's not really mixed well. It's a little thick. So I'm going to go ahead and break it down with my stirring brush here. And then I'm going to add just a drop of regular water. The water I add, I have a little dropper, has a little bit of flow improver in it. For the most part, it's just water. And I've created a pretty thin wash here. It's not going to be a big, dark, dramatic change. But it's going to take a lot of that sheen off. So if it looks like metal, I just don't want to look like brand new metal. Because as we know, the Harkonnens did not take great care of their equipment. And I'm going to do the same thing with the carryall. I mentioned this earlier. I'm just going through, this is a gloss, and I'm just hitting the little top just to make that little color pop. The other thing I did that you don't really see here, I think I feature it in another video a little more prominently, but I lightly dusted the bottom of the vehicles, or at least the harvesters, to give it a little bit of a sandy, weathered look. And that's it.